Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. North. Lips spread, but others sing no more. The flayed men tell no tales, and so a bard is required. A bard? Assume? He worried what that would mean, what that had meant for the lips sent there, and why they sang no more. The Bolton's reputation was well known to him, and he had left strict orders on how close to get. Did they know, or were there other reasons? He knew that a large number of small folk had made their way to Winterfell, the small town outside the keep expanding evermore to take them, but was there more at work there than he knew? He wished Bronn hadn't decided to leave his service, a bard a far harder thing to use, and especially one who'd fit in the north, but he needed to know and almost laughed when it hit him. It was time to bring the Boltons an offer, and he hoped Wyman agreed. The notes he walked to the fire, and after throwing them into it, he went downstairs for his meal. A sleepless night followed before he saw the man enter, and he smiled to see him alone. The Crossroads Inn 2095 AC. The Blackfish. The meal was hot and the ale cool, and he enjoyed them both. He was tired and in need of one night's sleep in a comfortable bed, and so he paid the coin and was happy enough with the room. Waking the next morning, he broke his fast and mounted his horse, the ride to the Vale ahead of him. He had enjoyed the tourney, meeting with his grandniece and nephew, Sansa looking the picture of cats, but the girl had more sense than his niece, and Robbie found he liked quite a bit. The young man had a good head on his shoulders, was no slouch with a blade, and finding out he was betrothed had made him even more keen to travel back with him and get to know him better. So when Jon and the others had left, he stayed and traveled with Robb and the Manderleys. He'd enjoyed hearing tale from his grandnephew of his siblings, of Bran climbing and Arya's wildness, both of which he now had some experience with. When he told Robb he'd be taking Bran to Squire the next year, the boy was happy for his brother, and it made Brandon proud to see the brotherly bond. Family, duty, honor. Robb, they are my house words. I can see you take them to heart just as much as you do. Your fathers and I intend for young Bran to live them too, he said, and Robb nodded. My mother, she and father, they're not getting back together. Oh, that seems to be the truth of things, he sighed. I hope she comes to my wedding, his grandnephew said. I've no doubt she will. I hope for an invite. He chuckled, and was pleased when Robb did too. Making camp, he laid down his bedroll and lit the fire, and after eating, he was about to sleep when he heard the sound of the horse. The man was leading it rather than riding it, and yet Brendan felt his fingers curl around his blades instinctively. I mean you no harm, friend. I'd just like to share the fire, by your leave, the man said, and Brendan looked at him warily before nodding. Why not? 2 men are better than one should bandits try their luck, he said, and heard a laugh from the other man, though he wasn't yet close enough to make his face out. A brave bandit indeed it would be to take on the Blackfish, the man said, and he rose to his feet. You have me at a disadvantage, he said before he saw the man's face and shook his head, thinking he was speaking to a specter. Richard? He asked. It's me, Brendan. Let's sit by the fire and speak on days past. Sir Richard Lonmouth said. I heard you were dead, he said as the man handed him the wine bottle. No, just lost in Westeros, Richard smirked. I thought I saw at the tourney, he asked, and Richard nodded when he handed him back the bottle. I was there, wanted to see the fat stag in his natural habitat, at a feast, gorging himself on food and groping girls that were far too young. He couldn't agree with the man more on that. Robert had always carried on disgracefully, and the crown on his head had made no difference to that. Even his son, it seemed, carried no honor or grace, and as he swallowed the wine, he did his best to forget about what the boy prince had tried to do. Though it seemed that was not to be the case, as Richard spoke on it, but a moment later, as for his son, Aerys' cruelty only came later. That boy has no business on a throne. Just like his father, Richard said. You forget I fought against the dragons. Richard, you may have not given up your allegiances, but people remember what Aerys did. But not what Tywin did. Not what Robert and Jon Arryn allowed him to do. Rhaegar was a monster. That's true, was Rhaegar. Would Ogan have been? Did Eldia deserve her fate, or Rhaegar's hers? The children and princess were innocent, but Rhaegar got what he deserved, he said, and Richard laughed. You fought on the wrong side once, Brendan, even now. You don't know the truth of it. Family, duty, honor, all come into play, not just one, Richard said, standing up. The dragons will return. You should try to be sure to be on their good side when they do, Richard said, walking back to his horse. He looked at him as he climbed up on his horse, as he nodded to him and turned it around before he began to set off, stopping at the bottom of the hill. I wish you good fortune in your travels, Brendan. May the road you find be the right one. Such cheer, Richard said, and just like the ghost he had thought him to be, the man disappeared into the night. He wondered if the man was truly a dragon supporter still. The girl and boy were somewhere in Essos, as far he knew, and perhaps, like all men, he longed for what he knew. Longed for a past in the hopes the future would be better. He could relate to that. His brother, his niece, and nephew, he longed for how he remembered them, how his family had once been, Hoster dead, Cat and Edmure lost. He longed for a family, for without it, duty and honor were poor substitutes. Riding to the Vale, he put his faith in a young boy who he hoped would restore some semblance of dignity to his house, hoped would restore them to their former glories, little knowing that miles away, heading in the opposite direction, Sir Richard Lonmouth was doing the exact same thing. Casterly Rock 29B5 AC. Melisandre. She was sitting in her room when the prince knocked, and she found herself most grateful to see him. While he tried to give everyone some of his time, she had found that she perhaps got the least of it, and so, the time she did get with him, she found precious. She especially liked it when they spoke of her god. She knew he'd not convert, but he was Riddlar's chosen nonetheless, and the future he spoke of intrigued her. He had told her that he'd have a temple built to Rosier in King's Landing, even without her asking. Just as he said he'd ensure a weirwood was planted in the godswood of the Red Keep. The freedom to choose was every man and woman's right, and when he took the crown, he intended it to be not only religious but economic freedom. The people would know. We must strive to be more than those who came before us. My lady, to be better, and I have a legacy to live up to. A family that wrote history, both good and bad. It's up to me to have people think of my family as the former. Jade said, making her smile. Now, though she knew his reasons, referred to Thoros of Myr, and to what tales he may have spoken to Beric Dondarrion about. So she told him of what she knew of the drunk priest, that he'd been sent here to bring Westeros to her god, to spread his word, and failed. He asked if she thought he still believed, and she thought on it silently for a moment, before saying she did. Once you've known Roxley's embrace, once you've let him in your heart, it's hard to let him go, my prince. Faith may be tested as mine own was, but my God is true, she said with a smile. Your faith was tested, my lady? He asked curiously. It was, and then in the flames I was shown a prince who'd bring the dawn, she said. And he looked to her for more of an explanation. She told him then of the visions, surprised that he didn't seem perturbed or worried by them, though she knew he had his own. When she spoke of ice and cold, he looked at her curiously and bid her continue, and then she listened as he spoke of the gifts he had been given. The book makes no sense, my lady, Valerian, maybe, but it makes no sense, he said, and she couldn't agree more. Apart from the ritual to bring dragons to life, the rest made no sense. Maybe it's only half of a whole, my prince. One part that needs the other to make it true. Why she had said it, she didn't know, but seeing the smile on the prince's face, she felt her curiosity rise. My prince, there is another book, which is key. I think I know where that book is, my lady, Jane said, excitedly. Dragonstone. She looked on as he walked to the chest, reaching inside to take out one of the Valyrian ingots. Many times he had asked if they could be reworked, and she had told him of Cohoric smiths who claimed they could. But as he looked at the ingot in his hand, he smirked before putting it back into the chest. Saying nothing about them, he walked back and reached his hand to her shoulder. My lady, I ask you to be on the beach tonight. It's time for me to be who I was meant to be, Jake said. My prince, tonight I fly, my lady, tonight I become a dragon rider, he said, and she felt her heart race as more of her vision was proving itself true. The rest of the day seemed to last forever. Eating her meal, she found her appetite to be barely able to be contained, and once she was done, she went to her rooms. Waiting for the time to come, each hour felt like a day, and she was beginning to think she'd not make it until finally the knock came to her door. My lady, it's time, her guard said, and together all three of them walked to the beach. She looked up to see the moon full and to see the bronze dragon fly, his scales reflecting the light, but it was the white one. She searched for, finding it and looking in awe as it came in to land. She, like those around her, nervously waited in anticipation. When she saw the prince, she was surprised to see him dressed so, and she looked on as he spoke to the white dragon. The noises the dragon made, she could only guess, were ones of happiness. Casey Silvergon, Rhaenix. Casey Silvergon, Henkiri. We will fly, Rhaenix. We will fly together, she heard the prince say, and she closed her eyes and gave praise to her god. Casterly Rock, 295 AC. Jon. From the moment he had come back to the rock, he had known what he was building up to. He had felt it, felt her, and her eagerness for them to fly. Had he not had so much else on his mind, so much that he needed to do so quickly, then he didn't know if he'd have been able to put it off for even the day he had. But he did have things he needed to take care of, so he had spoken to Tyrion and to Jaime about the need for Tyrion to be more active in things. He had explained his reasons and hoped they were understood. Then he had told everyone it was time for him to fly, time to take to the skies, and he had waited for the inevitable arguments as to why he could not. Fly where? Jaime asked. Nowhere in particular, Reign 6 will decide. I need to learn to be able to do it. I don't intend to just fly across Westeros. Not yet, at least, he said softly, though not softly enough. Not yet. What does not yet mean? Jenna asked, her voice raised. There are places I need to go, places I need to travel to, places I don't have the time to visit, but I must. Before it's too late, I must, he said, looking to her. Where? She asked. Summerhall, Dragonstone, High Heart, and the Tower of Joy, he said, looking to Arthur when he said, the last one. Alone, Jay, you cannot go alone, Arthur said, and he saw Jaime and Jurian nod in agreement. I need to know what I'm doing before I even consider bringing anyone on Redix with me. Once I do, then we can discuss it more. But it's time. I know it, and Redix knows it. When? Jaime asked. Tomorrow night, he said, and saw them look to each other and nod reluctantly. When all the others had left, he asked for a moment alone with Jaime, and once they were alone, he tried to explain it even more to him. I need to do this. With Rhaenix, I can go to where I need and return quickly. I can be in and out of those places without being seen, he said, looking to Jaime, who shook his head. She's huge, Jon. People may not notice you, but a large white dragon. Jaime said doubtfully. We can fly high. She can see better than I, and I can ward to check the places out before we go near them. I'll not take any risks, he said, and Jaime chuckled humorlessly. You're talking about flying on a dragon, Jon. That's the risk. It's not like falling off Winter. I know, but I have to do this. Those places, I need to see them, and I don't have the time. What we need to do, it's getting closer, Jaime. I can't be traveling for moons. It just can't, he said, and smiled, when Jaime nodded his agreement, which Jon was glad of. Reluctantly, though, it was given. Arthur proved to be another case altogether, the knight basically demanding to come with him. While Jon got him to stand down, for now, he knew that when he did decide he was ready to fly to those other places, that Arthur would come with him, and not even Rhaenix would be able to stop him. Waking the next morning, he knew it was time to go about the other things he needed to do, so he refused, or postponed, as he could never truly refuse Joy anything, their ride, and asked Satin and Brienne to come with him. He was happy to see their reactions. While Satin was shocked, he knew he could trust him, and Brienne, knowing, was even more important. Now, with Walder as her knight, he went to Melisandre and talked over things, inviting her to witness the dragon ride, knowing how much she'd wish to see it for herself. It was surprising to him that things he'd struggled on for moons, the ingots, the book, suddenly seemed clearer to him, something he later spoke to Cyril about. You say it just came to you, as if just then and there, Shirella asked. Aye, it did. It was odd. Strange. I know I discussed these with her, with Marwyn and Lamara too. We've discussed it countless times, so why now? He asked, and she shook her head, clearly as unaware of the answer, as he... Are you really going to fly tonight? She asked, and he smiled. It's time. You'll be there. Of course, you think I'd missed the first dragon rider in over 100 years. Rhaenyra said excitedly. The masters? She asked. I'll speak to them. I don't want them too close. Don't share your work with them, and speak only in general terms should they ask you of them. He said, looking to her, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. I'd never, she said before she saw him smile. You don't trust him? I don't know if apart from my uncle, I'd trust any of them to know too much about a dragon. When he told her that he may soon be flying away for longer and more frequent trips, he saw the worry and disappointment on her face, quickly explaining that Rhaegar wouldn't be going anywhere for some time. He then found himself enveloped in one of the tightest hugs he had ever known, simply by promising that, as soon as he was able, he'd take her flying. She trusts you. You're our blood. I think of any you'd be who she'd be happiest to have with me when we fly, he said, and she smiled and laughed as she spoke, excitedly while trying to work out when that could be. With Marwyn and Lomara, it was different reactions. The mage was fascinated by the dragons. His curiosity, while true and perhaps not threatening, did, however, worry Jon. Despite himself, despite knowing how helpful the man was, he had still belonged to the Order. And for Jon, knowing what he needed to do to those men, and knowing the Maester wasn't fully behind him, worried him. He would speak to Atamon, to Rhaenys, try and see if they could remove the worry from his head, but he was adamant that the mage and Lomara could only visit the dragons while under supervision. That, and he'd also limit what they could do when they did so. He had no issue with speaking to the men on other matters, the glass candles, the dreams, but on this, he felt he was right. This evening? Marwyn asked excitedly. Aye, as soon as it's dark, come to the beach, and who knows, you may see a boy fall on his arse very quickly. He japed to lass he was glad to hear. I look forward to seeing it, my prince, Merwin said, and for a moment he thought he meant the fall until he realized the Maester meant the flight itself. While the others ate dinner, Jon grabbed dressed, his clothing something he'd not worn before. Standing in front of the looking glass, he looked for the first time. When he was a Targaryen, grabbing some food, he made his way to the caves. Arthur and Jars walking behind him, and he saw the smile on Arthur's face at what he was wearing. Sitting beside his sister, he felt her excitement, and his son's too. Both of them eager to be in the air, to have him fly with them. Locaeron also looking forward to having his own rider on his back soon. And though a little jealous, his son was happy for Rhaenys too. It's time, Jack, Rhaenys said, and he nodded, walking out of the cave. Night had fallen, and he watched as Rhaenys and Lageron too to the sky. Rhaenys eager to loosen her wings, to relax before she risked taking him up on her back. By the time the moon was high, she was ready, and he looked on as she flew towards him and landed a few feet from him. He turned and gave a reassuring nod to a worried Jaime and walked to her head, leaning in as he spoke. Cassie Sovegon, Rhaenys. Cassie Sovegon, Hankiri. We will fly, Rhaenys. We will fly together, he said, and felt the trill showing her pleasure when he did so. Zero Sierra Gay Ja. It's time, Jay, he felt her say in his head, and he nodded. He carefully climbed up her wing before hearing her impatiently tell him his feet couldn't hurt her. Reaching her back, he saw an indentation, almost a saddle in of itself, and sitting in it, he was surprised how well he fit, how well they fit together. Sovegon Rhaenys, he said, and felt it then. Once, twice, her wings moved, and he was in the air. She flew low at first and waited. Once he told her he was comfortable, told her he was ready, she asked him. Where? How fast? She asked him to tell her what to do. And he did. She flew high when he asked her, flew slow, flew fast. She flew low over the sea, the waves beneath them splashing him as her wings dipped into the water. He felt Lageron fly close to him too, his son almost flying playfully, and Jay thought he was laughing until he realized it was him and not the dragon who was making the sound. Heading out to sea, he directed her to fly further, longer, and was shocked when they flew over an island. Knowing they had flown north, it could only be Faircastle, and to his amazement, they'd covered the distance in minutes. Turning back, she flew high over the rock itself onto Lannisport, and he looked down at the pinnacle ships and saw they looked like toys. Rhaenys shared it with him, her eyes far better than his, her vision picking things out that he could have missed. It was incredible. The flight, the feeling of the air in his face, the feeling of closeness that he'd always felt with her now even more apparent, more visceral, more true. They were bonded, meant to be. She was he and he was she. He felt it now, more than ever, he felt the bond they shared. How long it was until they turned back, he didn't know. He saw the worried gazes disappear when they saw him on her back, and after telling her too, she landed. Karabosi, Mondia. Thank you, sister, he said after he jumped from her back, his excitement matched by her own, as he leaned in closer to her head. We will fly more, little brother. Fly more and fly further than any together, she said, and he smiled, looking into her eyes. Together, always, he said, and felt her joy. Hi, Garden 2095-2096 AC. Lolina. She lied to her face. She actually lied to her, and not just to her, but to her mother and best friend too. Though perhaps her new husband was her best friend now, she thought as she chuckled. For moons, she had kept it up to. Oh, she knew she'd eventually confided in Sansa, but for moons her granddaughter had actually kept up the mummery. A few moons earlier, she had been so worried that she'd practically slept in her granddaughter's room with her. She had her meals there, washed the girl herself. Olenna fed her by her own hand, only leaving her side when it was absolutely essential, even going to the privy in Margaery's room rather than her own, and having clothing brought to her instead of going to her room to dress. Oxley, too, had stayed as much as she could, both of them waiting and hoping the fever would break and Margaery would awake. Lomies was no help, not in helping Margaery recover, nor in assuaging their worries. If anything, it was Sansa and her wolf who kept them from losing their minds. The Dray was convinced that Margaery would wake soon, and while at first she put it down to hope, she wondered if it was more than that. "Jon," Margaery sighed as she washed her face with the damp cloth, Olenna feeling a smile come to her face as she did so. "Hush, sweetling. Rest," she said softly, and felt Margaery relax and drift off to sleep. Something she did herself after a while, the sound of Margaery's voice and her movements on the bed waking her. "I take this man," Margaery said, and when Olenna's eyes cleared, she swore she saw a smile on her granddaughter's face. "My love, my husband," Margaery said, and Olenna gasped, turning to see Sansa and Allery, who had just walked into the room. Did I just hear that right?" Allery asked, and Olenna motioned to her to keep quiet. Though Margaery spoke nothing further that night. She's dreaming right of the future, it must be," Sansa said, and both she and Allery nodded in agreement. Thankfully, with Willis, she wasn't needed as much as she would have been if it was just Mace running things, her grandson knowing what did and didn't need her attention, and only speaking to her on pressing matters, even going so far as to interrupt his own time with Margaery to do so, and she felt her pride rise at helping to raise such a boy. Garland and Leonette came to see her too, and yet when they were there, or when Willis was, Margaery remained silent, not speaking once. When they were gone, though, she spoke more and more. She called out for Jon, for her husband more than once. She had them chuckling one night when she had some argument with him in her head, and Sansa practically swooning another when she said how much she missed him. One night, as she was sitting with her alone, the words she spoke were more garbled, Olenna needing to move in and place her ear close to her mouth to hear, and what she said stunned her. A tree, they had married in front of a tree, just her granddaughter, Jon, and his guards, and she felt her anger rise. Had they? No, he wouldn't, she wouldn't, would she? She called for Lamis and asked him to check, to see if that was what was wrong, if that was something that could have been causing it. The Maester looked at her bemused, and Olenna was incredibly annoyed that she had to actually spell it out. Once he checked, she was relieved to find that they had not done anything. Margaery was a maid still, and she had sworn the Maester to keep this to himself, warned him what would happen should he not. "My sweet, foolish child," she said, kissing Margaery's forehead, when the Maester had left. She knew they wouldn't. Margaery wouldn't. And Jon, no, the boy was far too dutiful and respectful to do anything that could be considered dishonorable to her granddaughter. Had she not been running a fever and lain asleep for days, she'd never have even considered it, but she had, and so it meant that Olenna had to, knowing full well that the first time could be painful and that other issues could arise from it too. They all breathed huge sighs of relief when Margaery awoke the next day, her granddaughter unsure where or how long she'd been out for. Once Lamis had examined her and found her to be well, and after Margaery reassured them herself, she had asked the question that had preyed on her mind, finding herself annoyed and angry when her granddaughter lied to her face. "It was a dream, grandmother. I must have dreamt Jon and I were wed," Margaery said, and Olenna stared at her granddaughter, surprised to see her stare back. "I knew it. I told you so," Sansa said, happy to be proved right. "What was the wedding like? Was it beautiful?" "I bet it was beautiful. Your dress, what was your dress like?" Sansa asked excitedly. "A tale for another time, Sansa. Despite just waking up, you look tired, sweetling. I'll have some food brought, and then you can get your rest." Allery said, kissing her daughter on the cheek, "And no more dreams. You'll be wed soon enough, as it is." Her good daughter said, laughing, as she turned to leave. Olenna didn't leave, however. She waited until the meal was brought, until Sansa had also kissed Margaery's cheek before she left, and then she turned to her granddaughter, Margaery looking at her nervously. "The truth?" she asked simply, and to the point. "It is the truth, grandmother. I had a dream about Jon, that was all. Margaery said, and even though she knew she was lying to her, she said it with such surety that Olenna doubted herself. So you have not run off and gotten married in secret, without your family, without the people who love you by your side? She said, trying to guilt Margaery into telling her the truth. I would never run off, grandmother. Margaery said, and she resisted the urge to just shout out that she knew the truth of things. And you would never marry a boy just so you could do more than just kiss, she asked, and saw her granddaughter sit up, her thorns on full display when she spoke. I would never. Jon would never. We're not children, grandmother. We can control ourselves. Margaery said annoyedly, almost forcing Olenna to laugh. Indeed, she said, raising her eyebrow. Of all the things, I've just woken up, and this is how I'm treated. Margaery pouted. I'm sorry, sweetling. My worry has robbed me of my senses, she said, hugging her granddaughter and feeling her arms wrap around her. You know you can tell me anything, things you may wish to hide. You don't need to, not from me, she whispered. I know, grandmother, her granddaughter whispered back, and though she waited, she told her no more. Now, so for moons it had gone on, she had hinted, Jold, came right out and asked in nothing. Her granddaughter had kept the pretense up. Olenna had even gone as far as taking her on a trip to the Godswood, speaking up on perhaps having a dual wedding since Jon was from the north. She had mentioned how she was sure that Lord Stark and Jon's family would no doubt appreciate the gesture, and nothing. Not a word. Though in the end that did prove to be the catalyst for her granddaughter's confession, even if at first it was to Sansa and not to her. When she did finally come in and ask to speak to her, Olenna had sensed the worry and trepidation on her face. She knew it was time and allowed her granddaughter to set the pace. Grandmother, there's something I must speak to you on, Margaery said. Is there, sweetling? She replied as if she was in the dark. Jon and I, Margaery stuttered before as Olenna looked at her. Her granddaughter took a breath. We're married, grandmother, she said a moment later, looking to her pensively. Married, after all I said, after how many times I questioned you. You tell me now you're married, she said, her voice raised as she did her best to hold her smirk at bay. It wasn't planned, grandmother. It just happened. Jon. Oh, grandmother. I'm sorry. I wish to tell you, truly. Please don't be angry with me, Margaery said, jumping from her seat and running to her, grabbing her tightly as she cried against her shoulder. Look at me, sweetling. Am I disappointed you didn't confide in me? Yes, but I'm not angry with you, she said, wiping Margaery's tears. Truly, Margaery asked, hopefully. Truly, she said, smiling. Now, have you and Jon done anything else I should be aware of? She said, smirking. When Margaery shook her head before she blushed when she realized what she meant. We've kissed, grandmother, that's all, Margaery said, and she nodded, kissing her cheek. Margaery had explained then what and how it had happened, and even on her most cynical of days, Olenna had found the idea, if not the execution of that idea, romantic. When she knew that she wasn't angry or upset with her, and when she had agreed to go and speak to her mother and tell her the truth, she had then tried to convince her to visit Casterly Rock, pouting when told no. The time wasn't right for a visit, the reasons for one were not readily available, and while Margaery understood this, it was clear she wasn't pleased. Olenna trying not to feel a little satisfaction at annoying her granddaughter, as payback, even though it was not. Despite everything, the lies, the deceit. One overriding feeling was what Olenna kept feeling. Pride in her granddaughter, for keeping it up so long, for keeping up the mummery, for not wilting no matter the pressures she placed her under. She was proud and knew her granddaughter had just taken another step to becoming the queen she would be. My lady, a letter left, said, handing her the note. Who gave this to you? She asked, as she opened it. A maid, my lady, Left said, nodding as he walked out of the room, and Olenna read the note. A dragon roars and lets their flames loose. Rosier. She reached over and picked up the glass of wine, taking a sip. She smiled and thought on gray rats running for their lives. The Wall 2096 AC, Marwyn. Try as he might, he had not been able to fully gain the prince's trust. Lumor assumed it had to do with his reluctance to fully come on board with what was to happen to the conspirators. Yet when Marwyn pointed out that he too had yet to be fully trusted, soon realized it not to be the case. For Marwyn, it was clear it was more to do with being a master than with not being fully committed to seeing men he had once called brothers killed. Despite that, though, just in seeing the dragons, Watching as they flew and as the prince became the first dragon rider in over 100 years was enough. Seeing how the glass candles worked, finding out that blood was the key, and being unsurprised that his own didn't work was enlightening. The prince showing him warging at a level he couldn't understand was simply mind-blowing, as were the boy's own insights. Magic knows magic, Marwyn. It seeks it out, feels its presence. Melisandre will tell you there is power in king's blood. What she won't tell you is that the more magic in yours, the more power there is. Jill said to him as they spoke on the beach one night. You believe that being a Targaryen allows you to use magic easier? He asked. Not just a Targaryen, do you know the history of my family, my mother's family? G.A. asked, looking at him. I know some, he replied, and told him the parts he knew. Myths and legends are far more based in truth than we ever imagined. In the north, they say Bran the Builder built the wall, Winterfell, Storm's End. They say my family defeated the Ward King, killed his sons, and then married his daughters. For 8,000 years, the Starks have ruled the north based on Bloodmaester. But is it based on blood right or because they carry the magic in their blood? He had pondered on it all the way to the wall, eager for the journey both to see Aemon once again and because the prince had told him there were books and scrolls there he should read. He and Lumara had both been asked to undertake the journey to the wall, to go there and read about the myths and legends and to see which were the most prevalent ones, and to also speak to Aemon. Lumara had been like an excited child. He'd known of but not met Aemon Targaryen. He knew that Rhaegar had corresponded with the man, and they discussed prophecy. He too had written and spoken to Aemon on such things, but never in the flesh. While a small part of him wondered if Jair was having them both leave so they rose, no objection to how the maesters were dealt with. But they would not, had not, and even should they, the fate of those men had been sealed once he'd given Jair the names. How much further? Lumira asked, the man shivering on the horse beside him. Not far, a day, 2 at most. One of their guards, a Manderly man, said. Thank the gods for that. His old friend said, making Marwyn chuckle. Seeing the wall once again, he thought more on Jack's words. Magic knows magic, the king had said, and the wall was magical. Of that there was no doubt. How it was built. How did it stand? Why it was built. All of these questions ran through his mind as they rode alongside it. The one he came back to most, though, was whether the magic in the wall was a tangible thing. If so, could it be harnessed or weakened, and what amount of power it may contain. They rested up at a small stream that night, eating well and drinking better. Lannister Gold spending well even at the wall. He found his sleep disturbed by strange dreams, fields of ice, and a giant weirwood tree, its blood-red leaves still despite the wind's howls. Upon the branches stood hundreds of ravens, all cawing at him, and he ran as the biggest of them. The one with 3 eyes flew towards him. Marwyn, Marwyn, wake up, he heard the voice, as he was roughly shaken. What? He said sleepily, as he sat up. That must have been a seriously bad dream you were having, you shouted the whole camp awake, old friend. Lumira said, looking at him with concern. What? Oh, it was nothing strange, though, he said, trying to remember what it was about the birds which had scared him so. He ended up sitting awake by the fire for the rest of the night, not keen to go back to sleep, and tired though he was when they set off the next morning. He felt the better for it. They reached Castle Black that evening, the Lord Commander welcoming the supplies and them, and having his steward show them to rooms before they were taken to see Aemon himself. The master was blind, aged, and yet there was a spark of life he'd not seen in him in many a year. Something more vital about the man, and when he heard them enter his head turned to look in their direction. Marwyn watched as he nodded to his steward before asking for ale to be brought, and as the man left, Aemon bid them sit by the fire. Omen, it's good to see you, old friend, he said warmly. Would that I could say the same me, Erwin. But alas, my eyes see nothing these days. Aemon chuckled, and Marwyn couldn't help but smile. Aemon, this is Lumara, the former Maester of Dragonstone. We've been sent to speak to you by Jaime Jon Snow, he said, changing the words at the last minute as the steward walked back in. That'll be all for the night, Chet. Go get some food and off to bed with you. I can hear your yawning from here. Aemon said, his voice full of mirth. Aye, thank you, Maester, the steward said, glad to be sent away, it seemed. He waited until the man was long gone, even nodding to Lumara to check the door, which he did. Once they were sure they were alone and wouldn't be disturbed, he turned to Axamon and leaned in close. We've been sent by your nephew, Aemon. He wishes us to help you look into some of the books and scrolls, asks us to read up on the myths and legends, and to see what we can find, to seek what is being written of most there amongst the tales. He whispered. The long night, Aemon said simply, catching him and Lomara by surprise. The long night, Maester Aemon? Lomara asked. When I first came here many years ago, I brought some of mine own books, gifts from my brother and other family. But Castle Black and the Night's Watch had its own library. There were accounts of former maesters, lord commanders, and treatise on many subjects, more and more referring to the long night, Aemon said, as Marwyn looked to Lomara. We will need to read them, Aemon. We may be here sometime, just to find them all. Marwyn said and heard Aemon laugh. Aemon? I allowed my nephew to take some of mine own books with him, some he found himself drawn to also. After he left, over time I'd find myself drawn to a particular scroll or tome. Find myself picking up a book here and there. Over the years I'd ignored it, mainly when I felt this way, but after speaking to Jaime I no longer did. Yain said, getting up and asking them to follow. They walked from the room, down some stairs and into a cavern of ice, and he and Lomara looked at each other in stunned silence as the maester lit the candles and the sheer volume of books, scrolls, and tomes was revealed. Whatever it is my nephew sent you for is in there. I shall be glad of your company. It seems we'll be spending quite some time together, old friend. Aemon said, and Marwyn couldn't do anything other than nod. Casterly Rock 29-6 AC. Tyrion. He was scared. He thought he was nervous. He was sure of it. But the truth of the matter was, he's scared. When the raven came from Oberyn saying that Arianne had set off, he'd felt excited. He couldn't wait to see her again, nor stop himself from smiling at just the thoughts of it. But when the news came that the sails had been seen, that the ship would be arriving on the next tide, his nerves and worries took over. Despite reassurance from Jon, he hadn't been able to let go of the idea that time apart was not, as his nephew had called it, a path to true feelings. Instead, it would simply prove those feelings false. Still, he dressed in his best and organized the welcome committee, Jaime giving him the honor of doing so along with Kevin. And now, as he went down in the lift, he steadied himself. I thought you'd never make it. Jon japped as he walked from the lift. I couldn't let you all have all the fun. Soraya, will you be joining me in the carriage? He asked, hoping that she would, and he'd not have to ride alone to Lannisport. I'm afraid not, my lord. I feel the need to ride today, Soraya said, smiling at him, which he returned. As he walked to the carriage, he felt Jon's footsteps behind him, and he stopped before he got in, waiting to hear what his nephew would say. You are Tyrion of House Lannister, of House Targaryen, a prince, a hand and a soon-to-be dragon rider, and you are more than enough for any woman, even a princess. Jon whispered in his ear, and he smiled at his nephew as he climbed into the carriage. Ever since their talk, he had taken more and more of a role in things, his duties to both houses keeping him occupied and surprising him. He and Jaime had discussed what would happen if a conflict arose and if House Lannister's needs and the king's clashed. His brother, turning to him, had laughed. He, were the crown. As hand to the king, that's what was most important, and so it would be the crown they looked to first. What if they clash, though? What if what's beneficial to the crown is not to our house? He asked. I think our house has benefited enough with Jon, not on the throne. Do you really think we'll suffer when he takes it, or in putting him there? As the carriage traveled at speed to Lannisport, he wondered, though Jon had told him he was a wolf and a dragon, and Tyrion wondered it that made him a lion and one. If it ever came to it, who was his loyalty to, his brother who he loved from the moment he was born, or his nephew who had fulfilled his lifelong dream? Today it seemed he'd have no time to answer that question, as far too soon the carriage pulled into Lannisport and he was at the docks before he knew it. Come, we've got a princess to greet. Jon japed as he opened the door. Soraya and Soraya standing close by. Very well, if I must, he said, rolling his eyes, forcing Jon to laugh loudly as they walked to the dockside. Once they reached it, they waited, Kavan arriving a few moments after they did, and when he saw the golden spear piercing the red sun on the sails, he smiled. She was here. It seemed to take forever for the ship to pull into the dock, then longer for the Dornish party to appear on deck, and even longer for him to finally see her. As soon as he did, though, he couldn't see anything else. His smile was bigger than it had been in moons, as she walked down the gangplank. Princess Arianne, welcome to Lannisport, his uncle Kevin said. Lord Kevin, an honor to meet you. Arianne said with a curtsy. My nephew, Lord Tyrion, I believe you've met. Kevin said, and the next thing he knew, she was standing in front of him. Lord Tyrion, a pleasure to see you again, truly, she said, smiling at him, and he was almost speechless, just standing there taking in the vision she presented in front of him. The dress was Dornishan in the colors of her house, and while by the standards of some of the dresses he had seen her wore, it was demure compared to dresses in the West. It was scandalous. Every inch of her figure was clearly outlined, and since Tyrion had intimate knowledge of what the body beneath it looked like, she may as well have been naked. "My lord," she said, her smile still on her face, though it had slipped some. "Forgive me, princess. It's truly a pleasure to welcome you here, and I shall do my utmost to ensure your stay is as enjoyable as mine own was when I visited your home," he said, and saw her smile return to its former glory. "I shall hold you to that, my lord," she said, her voice dipping as she moved to greet her cousin. She and Sarella hugged and spoke for a few moments, and while she greeted Jon politely and not as enthusiastically as she had Sarella, it was already clear to him that she knew the truth of him. Something which, as he walked her back to the carriage, made him wonder. Did she also know his own truth? Had Oberyn and Nelaria spoken of it to her? Climbing into the carriage, he was surprised when she got in alone, her ladies and even her cousin Tywin traveling in one of the others, and so he nervously climbed in beside her. They had no sooner set off than he felt her hand on his thigh, her lips on his, and all doubts he had that she wished to continue where they'd left off were quickly forgotten. "I've missed you, my lion. Have you missed me?" she asked when she finally stopped kissing him, her eyes looking directly into his. "Every day," he said, and the smile she gave him made him grab her face to kiss her even more deeply than she had him. By the time they'd arrived back at Casterly Rock, she was pouting. Only his whispered promise that tonight he'd do whatever she wished was enough to remove it from her face. It wasn't that he was averse to the idea of coupling in the carriage, nor even that they'd not have the time to enjoy the experience. It was that he wished to savor it. He longed to explore every inch of her and to use his lips to kiss as much of her as he possibly could. "Besides, my tongue is supposed to do the work that your poor fingers have had to do without it, is it not?" he whispered in her ear, and felt himself rise at the shudder she gave when he did so. At the rock, he allowed her the chance to settle in, Sarella and Tywin walking off with her in the direction of the guest wing. She had come with a large accompaniment, yet Tyrion found himself surprised by some of them. Her ladies were of houses he'd heard of, Sylvia Santagar, Tyenn Sand, her cousin, who Tyrion had barely greeted. He remembered now to his great shame. There was also Jane Ladybright and Jane Fowler, along with Janessa Blackmont. Yet the knights and guards she brought were of lesser-known houses, and to Tyrion's surprise were not any of the men she had been surrounded with when he had met her. He resolved to ask her about it later, though he knew that, in truth, he may not. There were far more pleasurable things for them to discuss or do than speak on men who were not here. "The princess is settled?" he asked his aunt when he walked to his brother's rooms. "She is. I look forward to speaking to her," Jaina said, and he looked at Half's aunt, wondering if she knew of them. "I think you'll like her, Aunt," he said when he figured that she didn't, and was instead speaking more generally. "If she's anything like her uncle, I may indeed nephew," Jenna said, and he smiled as he thought about his family liking her and tried not to let his mind have the run of itself. Tyrion loved feasts, usually. Tonight, though, he did not. Protocol demanded that Irian sit beside his brother, and so Tyrion was sitting with Janessa Blackmont and not the woman he wished. He knew that this was the formal welcome feast, and that next time they could sit wherever they liked, but still the night seemed never-ending. When the dancing came, he was glad it was his brother who danced with her. His uncle, too. He had asked Jon to dance with her, knowing his nephew to be the best dancer among them, and been surprised when the boy refused. Though his nephew's reasons made him appreciate him even more, Jon telling him he disliked seeing Margaery dance with anyone else, so he'd not be the one to dance with Arianne. "My lord, you don't dance?" Janessa asked, her voice a little disappointed. "I find people make fun of my size enough, my lady. To see me dance would be to invite it even more," he said, and while she nodded, it was more. He felt that she accepted his answer than she agreed with it, and so he leaned in closer to her. "However, my lady, if you really wish to dance, there is no better partner than Sarchon," he said, pointing to his nephew. He resisted the urge to laugh when he saw her walk towards Jon, seeing the blush on Jon's face when she asked and knowing he'd not be able to refuse. Jansa smiling when his words proved true, and Tyrion, Jaime, and even Arianne all laughing at the attempted hidden scowls when others asked Jon to dance later. It was the hour of the wolf when he moved through the keep, the corridors deserted and the lights dimmer than they were just a few hours earlier. Arriving at the room, the guards gave him a nod, his presence obviously expected, and he was bid to enter without the need to knock. He saw her as soon as he did so, laying on the bed. Her silken small clothes were all she wore, and the look on her face was as predatory as the snakes of her country. "You made me wait," she said with a smirk. "Then I shall endeavor to make the wait worthwhile," he said quickly, undressing. "My eager lion," she said with a small laugh, her voice even more sultry than usual. "You're hungry, lion," he said, and the laugh this time was bigger as he grabbed her legs and began kissing his way up between them. Volantes 29-6 AC. Young Griff. Each day they traveled. He worried that they'd be too late, that just like always they'd miss her and arrive in a place she'd just left. The longest they'd stopped was for 2 days in Drocho. And apart from a day fixing the sails, they'd sailed non-stop, and yet he worried still. Even seeing the city in front of him, a part of him feared it to be a wasted journey. Jon seemed unperturbed by his worries, unconcerned, and it annoyed him and had led to more than one argument between them. His foster father not seeming to understand the necessity and droning on and on about the Tyrells and what marriage to Lady Margaery would bring. He loved the man, he truly did, but he had no sense of what it meant to be one of the last dragons, to have the future of his house resting on his shoulders. It had to be his aunt, as only together could they restore the majesty of House Targaryen, a silver prince and princess to bring about a golden age. Had his father lived then, Akon would have no doubt that he and Daenerys would have been married, even laughing when Septa Lemore suggested that perhaps it would have been he and Rhaegar. "My father would have used my sister to form an alliance, to bring a great house closer to the throne. Maybe Willis Tyrell or perhaps Quentyn Martell, that he'd have bought their loyalty with her hand," he said with a scoff. "But not with yours? A prince who would be king would surely be a greater prize," Duck said, and he nodded. "True, but I've no doubt my father would wish to see the Valyrian bloodline extended. My sister looked Dornish. My aunt looks like me. I've no doubt that just like our ancestors, my father would have wanted to see our line continue to show that which made us stand out from the others," he said, and Duck seemed to agree, though Jon and the Septa not so much. Jon had tried to tell him that even should they arrive in Volantis and find his aunt still to be in the city itself was far too large to be sure they could find her. But actually knew where she was. The Red Temple, he would find her there, of that he had no doubt. What connection his aunt had to the Red Priests, or to this Queety woman, he didn't know. But he did know they were connected. In Norvos he had been furious that they wouldn't allow him into the temple, that the priestess dismissed him so readily. He was Aegon Targaryen, the 6th of his name, the rightful king of Westeros, and these servants of a false god dared deny him. He would ensure that once he sat his rightful throne, once he had dealt with the traitorous lions, wolves, falcons, and stags, that he'd then deal with those in Essos who denied him also. "We should rest the night, Yakon. Go looking on the morrow," Jon said, when they docked, and he looked at the man incredulously. "For moons we've traveled, Jon. I'll not wait any longer than necessary. We look tonight," he said, his voice as full of determination as he could make it. "Very well," Jon said, though Egan could hear the reluctance in his voice, and it annoyed him. "You should stay here, Duck, and I will go," he said, and when Jon protested, he shot him a look which seemed to do the trick, though he disliked the way he stormed off down below deck. Fixing his sword to his side and dressing in his best clothing, he, Duck, and Halden left the shy maid and were soon walking the streets of Volantis. Halden informing him of the cultures of the Volantin and of their feelings on walking in the city, how they felt it beneath men and women of their substance to do so. While he thought that was a silly idea, he found he agreed with it. Partly also, men and women of substance needed to be shown to be above those lesser than them, and kings, he felt, even more so. Seeing the Red Temple, he was amazed by its size. He had thought the one in Volantis to be big, but compared to this, it was like looking at a home and then a castle. Large crowds surrounded it, and they needed to jostle their way to the entrance. Walking inside, he was as impressed with it as he had been the exterior, though not so much when he asked to speak to the High Priest, and was denied. "I demand to speak to the High Priest," he said angrily, and the girl just shook her head. "Only Rhaegar makes demands of his priests, not men, and certainly not boys," she said, and as she turned to walk away, he grabbed her shoulder, spinning her towards him. "Don't walk away from me," he said angrily, and around him, people stopped, and the large room he was in quietened. "Griff, we should go," Duck said, and he glared at him angrily before turning back to the girl. The woman who arrived was perhaps the most beautiful he'd ever seen, dark-haired and eyed, and she exuded confidence, which only made her more attractive, he felt. Though the look she gave him and the way she and the guards with her shook their heads, soon had his anger rising. Who was she to look at a dragon that way? Who were they, he thought. And yet he knew, should it come to it, he was outnumbered. You are not welcome here, false dragon. Go now in peace, or suffer a god's wrath. The woman said, and he looked at her perplexed. False dragon, what did she mean by that? I've come to talk to the high priest, to ask him questions, he said, standing his ground and trying not to gulp when the men around him moved quickly. The guards surrounding him ducked and howled very easily. We have no answers for you here, no desire to set you on a path to your destruction. Go and go in peace, she said, turning away. Daenerys Tay, he said, but never got to finish or ask the woman if his aunt was here, the guards removing them from the temple in the time it took him to realize she was gone. As they were just about outside, though, he saw her. Her silver hair was long and thick, her face more beautiful than even in his dreams. He felt his heart quicken, felt his breeches tighten as he looked at the beautiful dress, and imagined the body beneath it. He called to her, but she ignored him, and he cursed the dye in his hair, knowing that had she seen him for who he truly was, that she'd have then spoken to him right away. Walking back to the shy maid, his anger was replaced by something different. Hope, he had found her, she was here, and soon they'd be together. Soon they'd be wed. Then together they'd return and take their family's throne and make those who'd turned on his family pay. While Duck and Halden looked at him in confusion, Egon smiled as they walked and almost ran the last few steps up the gangplank when they arrived. We found her, Jon. She's here, he said excitedly when he saw Jon walk up from below deck. You spoke to her? Jon asked, and he shook his head as Duck explained what had happened. How do you know it was her, Aegon? If you saw her only for a moment, Jon asked, and another day it would have annoyed him. But for now, he was happy to answer the question. I know, Jon. I saw her. She's my aunt, and she's here. We need to find a way to speak to her, and this must go, he said, with his hands in his hair. Aegon, you can't. The disguise keeps you safe, Jon said, but he wasn't listening to his complaints anymore and just shook his head. After they had eaten and he'd gone to bed, he lay there, his eyes closed and his hand traveling down his body. Feeling his stiffness, he groaned as he tried to picture her in his mind, her silver hair, her body. His soon-to-be wife, his hand began to move of its own accord, and he felt himself getting closer to his release. He pictured her face as he did so, and especially her eyes. God's her eyes. Never before had he seen such eyes. One green and one blue. He heard himself shout her name as he spent. Daenerys, Aegon said as he fell back against the bed. The Citadel 29-6 ace. Theobald? He looked over the notes in front of him, his life's work, and he smiled, proud of his achievements. He had seen the dragons brought low, seen them finally humbled. Now, apart from an old man who'd die alone at the wall and 2 orphans with no means who were stuck in faraway lands, they were done. The Targaryens and their beliefs, their potential, were no more, and magic was back where it belonged, locked away in their vaults. They had a fool for a king now, but fools were easy to control, and Robert's appetites were those of a man and not a family who thought themselves gods. The reports on the prince were troubling, though madmen too were easily controlled. Still, perhaps it would be for the best if the younger son took over, something he'd discuss when next they met. Reading of Vyman's disappearance had given him pause, but it had also reassured him after Croslene's and Caelot's deaths. Had he been another of their member, he would have had no choice but to investigate. 2 deaths were suspicious enough as it was. 3 would have been too many. But Vyman was nothing to do with them, and while Caelot had caused distress, they had managed to replace him correctly. In Croslene, they'd lost a valuable member, and due to that fool Marwyn's interference, he still felt sure that the man had done something to make some of them ill. They'd not got their man in the rock. Samwell is Archmaester, Vaxling busy, he asked, turning to the young boy. I believe he and Archmaester Gallard have gone to visit Lord Hightower. Archmaester, Samwell said, and Theobald looked at him strangely, finding it odd the man would do such a thing. Are you sure, Samwell? He asked, and the fat boy nodded before explaining some more. I believe so, Archmaester. I delivered the letters to them myself, he said. Could you bring me one of them? Samwell. It's most odd for the Lord to ask for a visit. Of course, Archmaester, Samwell said, and he was glad to see the boy hurry off. He had been surprised when the boy had returned, but he'd been glad of it too. He and the others had wagered that the boy would stay with his family and not come back. When he did, though, Theobald decided to bring him close. The boy had worked closely with the mage, and in time he knew he'd get him to divulge some of Marwyn's secrets. He actually found that despite his clumsiness and size, Samwell was a bright young lad, eager to learn and a bit of an unpolished gem. One day he'd perhaps a suitable candidate to be brought into the order, as his demeanor would make him a useful spy. He drank some wine as he went over his latest treatise, A Definitive History of Westeros, a work that when finished would show the dragons for what they truly were, incestuous madmen, who were cruel and dangerous. As he was rereading the last chapter that he'd finished, this one dealing with Aegon the Unworthy, he heard Samwell walk in and saw the letter in his hand. "Will there be anything else, Archmaester?" the boy asked, and he shook his head, waiting until Samwell had left before reading the letter. "Archmaester Vaseline, I find myself in need of your counsel, and that of Archmaester Gallard also. As a man expert in the field of the study of the heavens, a study close to my own heart, and as Archmaester Gallard is known for his work on the Summer Isles, I have great need of you both. We received a recent arrival in Old Town, a prince from the Summer Isles, a man who shares my own interest in the stars, and with whom I've found my knowledge lacking. I'd like to discuss some things with you both before the man returns from a hunt he's on with my son. Your help in this matter is greatly appreciated, and should I be able to do anything in return, then you only need ask." Lord Lytton Hightower, defender of the Citadel, he reached over and poured himself another glass of wine, happy in the knowledge that the Order was still making friends, and wondering about the boon Vaxley may ask of Lord Leon. After finishing his reading and feeling hungry, he went to join the others for the evening meal, surprised to see that Vaxley and Gallard had yet to return, and calling Samwell to find out why. It was much later when the boy returned, Samwell having gone to the High Tower himself to speak to the Archmaesters, much to Theobald's approval. Lord Leighton asked him to stay the night. "Archmaester, I believe the hunt finished early, and the prince from the Summer Isles was pleased to speak to such learned men as Archmaesters Valen and Gallard." Samwell said, and he felt himself smile at that. "Thank you, Samwell. You've been most helpful. We really must speak more in your future. I see only good things ahead of you," he said, patting the boy on his back as he walked into his room. The Fall of the Masters, 29/6 AC. Casterly Rock. Jon. In the moon since he had returned from Highgarden, he had been busy, more on certain things than others, and had been glad that he'd approached Tyrion. How he had. Having Tyrion make certain decisions, ones he at first ran by him but soon didn't, had shown him the benefits and given him the time to do the other things he needed to do. He and Melisandre had talked more about the Red God, and he knew enough now. He felt that should Beric be drawn that way, he'd be able to perhaps bring him on side. And if not, he still felt sure he could make the man see things from his perspective. Marwyn and Lomara he had sent to his uncle. He needed them to do the research he had not been able to do. With Tyrion helping, he had finally gotten around to reading some of his father's letters for himself, some making him laugh, and others bringing him to tears as he saw how much his parents loved each other. Over and over, though, was the sense that being the prince that was promised meant more, and Melisandre had confirmed that Lomara had too. But mainly it was Walder who made him see. "Walder, did Nan speak to you on the long night?" he asked. "Aye, she did. The prince that was promised will bring the dawn and save us from the long night," Walder said, and Jon shuddered. He needed to go back to Winterfell to look at those drawings once more, to see if the library there contained more. But before that, he knew there would be some answers to be found at the wall. He and Rhaenys had flown more together, the bond growing ever stronger each time they took to the sky, and they'd flown even further, testing her range. Seeing when and how soon she got tired, Jon had also gotten more comfortable flying on her back, the movements, twists, turns, and drops all allowing him to feel even more ready. One night they'd flown until the early morn, arriving back at the beach as dawn rose. Just seeing the sun come up from the back of a dragon was more beautiful than he could have ever imagined. He had felt his son's excitement, knowing it was almost time for his own rider, and felt Rhaenys's also, as she now felt ready to take others on her back. As they had come closer to the shore, he'd warged into a gull and had it fly over the rock, holding tight to Rhaenys's horn as he did so. "Sobergan Linton Rhaenys, Amygida. Fly home, Rhaenys. We have time," he said, and she flew and landed near the cave. Soon he was falling asleep against her back as she rested. He had written to Marguerite, his wife, and it made him have to stop himself from calling her that in the letters. Though never in his heart. He'd sent letters to Sansa, to Robb, to Arya and Bran, spent time with Joy and sparred with Arthur and Jaime. He'd watched as Joanna had celebrated her name day, and as she began to grow, and found himself looking forward to seeing her walk and hearing her talk. Mostly, though, he practiced the writing and made sure it matched. He studied the parchment, making sure it was the same, and he warged into the ravens, making sure he could send then where they needed to go. Once he was certain he could do what was needed, he contacted Richard and made the preparations. His men were in position, his allies on board, and the time had come. "Rosie X, it's time," he said as he sat beside her in the cave. Arthur, Jors, and Jaime waiting outside with Loras and Brienne. "For our family," Reich said. "For our family," he said, closing his eyes. Old Town 2096 AC. "Sir Richard." The calling of the bird as it landed him made him smile. For almost 3 weeks he'd waited. He'd arrived early to make sure it was all in place, and had first made his way to the Citadel and spoken to Samwell. Charlie, the boy, eager to help, though he knew not the extent of what that help would be. After that he had taken a room and waited. He had answered some of his lips' requests, sent out orders. But in reality he was simply killing time. 4 and 10 in the end, that's what it came down to. 4 and 10 men who posed the biggest danger to the restoration out of any in Westeros. He wondered had it always been this small, and then remembered that the 2 who had fallen were part of it, but even with them it was astounding. That so few carried out so much, that they were responsible for so much destruction and loss of life, that they so hated everything his king represented, felt abhorrent to him. 4 and 10 located throughout Westeros, and to take them down it would take many more: Dorne, the North, the Riverlands, the Reach, Crownlands, and the Vale. In almost every region his men were ready, and it would start now. Gathering his things, he met with his man and made sure the ship was ready. He would sail north after this, the work that needed to be done there next on his agenda. Important work, he knew, but for his king. What would happen here tonight? What would happen in Westeros over the next week was even more so. "We're ready," his men said, and he nodded before entering the small boat that was taking him to the Citadel. His men waiting under the bridge for their own targets. "Both and make it look good," he said simply as he walked into the scribe's hearth and met with Samwell, handing him the letter. He waited. It didn't take long, seeing the men walk out. He almost laughed at the arrogance to stroll around without guards. The sheer fucking hubris of it. That alone would be the downfall of these men, and he took his seat and took out his food, listening to the men as those around him made their deals. Books being sold, letters being written. He even laughed when an acolyte came close to him to tout for business before he saw his clothing. As night fell, he made his way into the Seneschal's court itself, and saw Samwell beckon him to follow. The gray robe he wore and the maester's chain were those of a newly linked maester, one not many would know. And walking and talking with Samwell, they spoke as if he knew what he was saying. Soon he was being shown the table where Theobald sat, and from then it was just a matter of needing to wait for the right time. Dorne 2096. Sunspear, Oberyn. When the Raven arrived carrying the note, he had smiled. For moons he had walked on eggshells around the new maester, had made sure all the others had too. He'd allowed the man to sit in on meetings that a maester would be expected to, and apart from not being allowed to look after Doran, which the maester had objected to, the maester, for all intents and purposes, was the senior maester in Doran. However, he was not. Miles did most of the true master's duties. He handled the more sensitive of correspondence and managed Doran's treatments. Powron was not under any circumstances allowed treat but the minor ailments of any of their family, and over time, Oberyn knew he'd become suspicious. Not that he'd ever get that time. As soon as the Raven arrived, Oberyn had Sir Daemon and Obora take up position and sent the Raven to Yarenwood. Once that was done, he gave the signal, and his daughter and sworn shield grabbed the maester and dragged him to the large empty room, where Oberyn was waiting for him. "What is the meaning of this? Should the Citadel find out you've treated me this way?" the maester said, and Oberyn chuckled. "You really think the Citadel or anyone will ever hear from you again? Maester, I knew you people were stupid, but surely not that stupid." Oberyn said. "Why, I've done nothing." "What?" Pelrin said, his voice full of panic now. "True, you've not done anything to me or my family, simply because you've not had the opportunity. You should be grateful for that fact. It'll only be your life you lose today, Maester, and it will be quick. For others in your order, they will not be so lucky." "What, please?" the man said, and Oberyn nodded as he was brought to the ground. Picking up the sword, he stepped to one side. Oberyn looked to Daemon, to Obara, and Nymeria as he moved forward. Doran sitting in the corner with Areo looking on from a distance. In the name of his grace, Yaxeliers Targaryen III of his name, I Prince Oberyn, Nymeros, Martell, do hereby sentence you to die. The sword was quick and precise, and Tabra and Daemon let go of the man's arms as soon as the blade severed his head. Oberyn wiped the blade off and smiled before he closed his eyes. He thought of his nephew and his niece, of Alil and Aegon, and of all the people these men would have wished to see dead. Opening his eyes, he hoped the rest of Janesip's plan went as smoothly as it did here. Yarningwood 2096. Otar. He didn't understand what had happened. How had it happened? And what was to happen now? He was tied to the wall, the chains firm and unyielding, and standing in front of him, Anders was picking through items he knew well. Items he was beginning to realize. The man was going to use on him, and he didn't know why. He had brought him the scroll from Sunspear, Prince Oberyn's sigil, bound to get a rise out of the easily excitable young lord, especially given how he'd ranted and raved after the prince had left a few moons ago. Handing the lord the scroll, he saw the smile and prepared to offer his advice, though he never got the chance to. 1 minute he was standing looking at the lord as he walked towards him, and the next he was being beaten into unconsciousness. When he woke, he was tied to the wall, and he was baffled how he'd gotten there. They couldn't know, could they? He'd been so careful. For years he'd been careful, and he'd only offered advice when the lord was in the mood to listen, speaking in his ear of how having Quentin Foster was a good opportunity, and how a man made a better ruler than a woman, and enjoying seeing his ideas take root. When I was a boy, my grandfather used to tell me stories, tales of my family and what we once were before the Rhaegar came. Anders said, walking towards him, the object in his hand making Otar shake. Please, my lord, he said, but Anders wasn't listening. You know my grandfather loved House Martell. He loved them, he instilled that love in me and my father, and you took that and him away from him. Anders said, and Otar gulped. Lies, it was the viper, the prince. He poisoned him. Otar said, shaking his head. I will get the truth from you before this night is over. Maester, I swear on my grandfather. Anders said, and Otar screamed as the man moved closer, the point digging deep into his shoulder, and soon the pain became almost unbearable. The desert was cool, almost chilly, the moon high in the night sky as he was dragged through it. How long they'd been riding for, he didn't know, nor where he was now. The pain was numb now, but he felt it still, or he thought he did. Anders was right. Gods, the things he'd done to him. Any men he would talk, and he had done so quickly, so eager was he for the pain to stop. It didn't, though. On it went for hours and hours, long after he had told the man everything he knew and had done. He had passed out and been woken back up. He'd been beaten, burned, cut, and still it wasn't enough. He was actually relieved when they took him out to the horses. Ahead of him, Anders had stopped, and he saw him looking down into something, and as he was dragged in front of him, Otar tried to get his eyes to focus. You took my grandfather from me. Fuck you to the seven hells, Anders said as he kicked him in the chest. The fall wasn't as hard as he expected it to be, the hole not as deep as he had feared, and as he reached out and tried to rise to his feet, Otar felt he may actually have a chance to live. He could get out of here and maybe be able to make his way back to the Citadel. As long as they left him before morning, he would have a chance, which was when he felt it, and then he heard the hiss. The first bite was bad, the second worse, and as the clouds that covered the moon moved away, the light shone down. There were hundreds of them. They crawled over him, moved towards him, and as the moon's light faded, he looked into one of the sets of eyes that were closest to him. His bladder emptied, and it seemed to excite them, and as the bites became too numerous to count, as the poison raced through his veins, his final thought was, where did they find so many red ones? Riverlands 2096 AC. Stonehenge. Master Lothar. The man ran through the fields, feeling them close behind him, wondering who they were and what they wanted. He had thrown his pouch of gold at them, yet they had still chased him, and Lothar was beginning to think they weren't bandits after all. The Raven had arrived with Theobald's message, and he had hurried off to meeting, never bothering to ask himself why he was being recalled. He had instead bid Lord Janos farewell. For now, said he'd be back within the moon, and had set off from Stonehenge to ride to Seaguard. Traveling alone was a risk he knew, but he couldn't allow the Lord to know where he was going, and so he had taken the chance. As he tripped and fell over the broken branch and the men caught up with him, he felt a fool for doing so, and hoped it would not cost him more than a beating. Please, I gave you my coin. I have nothing else to give, Lothar said, and saw the clubs the men held in their hands. It's not your coin we want. We serve a higher calling, the man said as the first blow beat down upon him. On and on they came, and as each one did, he wondered why. In the midst of his pain, he wondered why, and as he breathed his last breath, he found to his dismay that he would never know. Raventree Hall, Maester Martin. When the Raven arrived, he made his preparations. A meeting was something he'd not been a part of in many years, and so something important must be going on. He found himself excited to be going back to the Citadel, to see his old friends. Once more would have been enough to cause it. Knowing that something must be getting decided, though, that made him even more eager to travel. It took a day or so to get Lord Tytez's permission, and no matter how much he complained, it was only after agreeing to take guards with him that he was allowed to leave. Lord Tyte telling him that since he was in his service, it was up to him to see to his safety. Had he not found the man to be a dullard, then he may have appreciated it. As it was, it simply inconvenienced him. "Are you ready, Master?" Tom said, and he nodded as they rode out the gate. They made good time, and as they camped that night, Tom and Ardos told tales, some which even made him chuckle, and after eating, he slept comfortably. They were riding the next morning when the men arrived, wearing House Tully colors, and carrying a letter from Lord Tytos. "We need the Master to come with us. The Lady Catelyn has taken ill and needs his help. He may be needed for some time," the large man in the lead said. "Very well, we'll ride there first, Maester." "Aye," he said reluctantly, knowing he had no choice. "Lord Tytos requests you both to ride back to Raventree Hall. The Maester can send a raven when he's ready to leave, and you have your own duties to see to," the large man said, and Tom looked ready to argue. "Go, Tom, sir," he looked to the man who introduced himself as Sir Robert Long. "Sir Robert will ensure I arrive safely, and if he's right, then it could be some time until I can resume my travels," he said, glad of the opportunity to get rid of his guards and hoping the detour wouldn't take too long. "If you're sure, Maester?" Tom asked. Yeah, I am," he said with a smile, and Tom and Ardos rode off. He rode on with the men who told him of the woman's symptoms, and so he asked to stop off to collect some herbs. He was worried in case they may not have them, and he didn't wish to delay more than necessary. He was collecting them near the steam when it happened, the gauntlet gripping tight around his neck and pushing him forward, the water going into his mouth. He felt the constriction of his lungs as they filled, and he thrashed to no avail. The man far too large and much too strong. As his movements stilled, as his last breaths came, he couldn't understand why House Tully would wish him dead. They reached 2096 AC. The Rose Road, Master Arden. He had been lucky the Raven arrived while Lord Tarley was on a hunt with his son. Had he been there then, nothing he'd have said would have made the man agree to let him return to the Citadel. As it was with him gone, the lady was only too keen to see him go, even more so when he suggested that he could carry a letter to her fat son and that he'd bring one back upon his return. The truth of the matter was he was glad for the opportunity of seeing Theobald and the others. His time in the Reach had been an absolute waste. Rendell Tarley cared little for his insights or suggestions. Even when he gave them on military matters, the man barely acknowledged him. Though as bad as it had been previously, it had gotten even worse since his son was sent to the Citadel, the man seeming to blame him for it somehow, as if he had anything to do with sending the fat boy there. True, he was clever and could perhaps make a good maester, but the boy was soft and wouldn't have the heart to do what was needed to ensure the realm ran true. So he intended to make his points clear to the others once he arrived at the Citadel. After bidding the lady farewell, he made his way as quickly as he could to the Rose Road, hoping to meet up with Kate so they could travel together. He couldn't believe his luck when not more than an hour after arriving he heard the horse behind him, and he smiled when he saw his old friend riding hard. Though he soon looked on in shock when he saw the arrow in his back, and he began to panic when he saw the look of fear on his face. "Ride! They mean to kills us. Ride!" Kate shouted, and as he turned to kick his horse, he felt the thump of the arrow as it hit his chest, his fingers drawn to it almost instinctively. As the second and the third arrows hit him, he looked to Kate, who was riding on ahead, and watched on in horror as his friend's horse suddenly bucked, throwing him from it. Kate's, though, not the only one to hit the ground, as soon he fell too, his eyes fading as the blood flowed from his wounds. Who the men were, he didn't know, nor were they about to tell him. The last thing he heard as the sword entered his neck was one voice yelling to the other, "Aye, he's dead. Broke his neck. Wonder what spooked the horse," the voice shouted, as Arden was welcomed by the darkness. White Harbor 2096 AC. Wyman? When Myro arrived with the other man, Wyman knew it was time. The fall of men who deserved it was upon them. He had voted for this. Jon had asked for their decisions, and he had voted, and he felt relieved. It was happening, finally. Knowing who the no more truly served, he felt greatly relieved, and so he waited until night fell, and then escorted the man to the master's rooms. What happened inside them, he didn't know, only that when he walked inside, the master was dead and there were no marks or signs of a struggle. The mirror looked as if he died peacefully in his sleep, and Wyman thanked Jon for that concession. It wasn't that he didn't wish the man to suffer, or even that he couldn't have covered it up, but more he didn't wish the girl who found his body to be more upset than need be. "The others?" he said to Morao as they walked from the Meister's rooms. "We'll know soon enough. Have no fear, my lord. They will fall. All of them," Morao said. "And should they not?" he asked, his voice and face showing his concern. "There is always tomorrow or the day after. Trust me, my lord. Those men are not long for this world." He was breaking his fast the next morning when the scream came, he and Wylis being informed and Wyman telling his granddaughters and Robb later on. While upset, they accepted that the man had died peacefully in his sleep. And Wyman even gave the man a far better send-off than he deserved, saying words over his body and in front of his servants, and asking them to give a moment to the man. "When do you think we'll know, father?" Wylis asked, a little later that night. "Soon, Wylis. Soon." The Vale 2096 AC. Maester Coleman. Gods, the woman had been insufferable. He'd needed to wait until Master's own Maester had arrived, and still she'd complained. Accused him of abandoning her boy, of leaving him alone, and he sighed as he listened to her. Even lying to her about the letter, saying it was from her husband, ordering him to come to King's Landing, and it almost hadn't been enough. Eventually, though, he'd gotten to leave and been escorted to Gulltown to the ship that would take him on the first part of his journey. He'd unfortunately need to change ships in King's Landing, and he had no doubt she would. Lysa complained to her husband then he'd need to make an explanation, but he had no choice other than to lie to the woman, as she'd never have allowed him to leave otherwise, and he so wished to speak to his friends in person once more. As he stood on the deck watching the moon set, he smiled. How many years had it been since he had set foot in the Citadel? 22, 23. He wasn't sure, but he was very happy to be going back there once again. "You look happy, friend," the man said, walking and standing beside him. I'm to meet up with some old friends," he said with a chuckle. "Good, when you do, bid them hello from me," the man said, and he looked at him confused before he felt the blow to his head, and with no ceremony he was thrown overboard, the water covering him in moments. He struggled against the current, tried to reach the top, the blood flowing from his head, making him weak. As he reached the top, he looked to see the ship far off to the distance, the whiteness of the sails all he could see in the dark of the night, and he felt himself sink once more. Try as he might, he couldn't rise again. His body was too old and weak, his wound cut too deep, and he felt the coolness and calm of the water swallow him whole. The Vale 2096 AC. Master Jasper, where had they come from, he wondered as he rowed hard. He was too close to Iron Oaks for them to attack, surely. Though he also knew that he wasn't close enough, and that he'd not outrun them. Their horses were faster than his own, and like a fool, he had forsaken guards too eager to travel quickly and not to be found out. He had wondered how many others would he meet. Was it to be a full meeting? A conclave within a conclave? And he knew for it to be called something big must have happened. What that was, he feared he'd never find out. As the men chased him down, he looked back, and to his horror saw that the leader was wearing ears around his neck. Though it could have been worse, at least they weren't burned men. He rode as fast as he could, but in the end it was useless. They rode him down, and nothing, he said, would stop the mountain clansmen in their tracks. He screamed as he was held down, as his ears were removed, and as they beat him. But when it stopped, he felt some relief. Short-lived though it was. Feeling the blade in his stomach, he looked at the man in shock, though the pain was something he felt even more when the blade was then twisted and his stomach opened. "Why, you've taken my ears. You don't kill. Black ears don't kill," he cried. "Who said we were black ears?" the man said, and he knew by his voice that this was no clansman, though who he was he'd never lived to find out. King's Landing 29-6 AC. Barristan. Murder without trial was not something he agreed with, usually. Sure, there were exceptions. The Mountain and Lorch deserved no due process to his mind. When he'd first been told by Richard's man about Pike's cell, though he had thought the man needed to face a trial. It was only after speaking to Richard himself and finding the full extent of what he did that he changed his mind. I know there is nothing more in this world that the king would wish for than to see that man brought to trial, Barristan. Nothing. Richard said. Then why? He asked, confused. What these men did, must be dealt with. They must face a reckoning, and we must do it before Jack sits the throne. We cannot risk it. Barristan, not one of them can be allowed to escape. Richard said, reaching over and touching his shoulder. I know, old friend. It's why I do not ask you to do this yourself, much though I'm sure you'd wish to if you heard him confess. Instead, leave it to my man. We'll take care of it, Richard said, and he nodded. When he had found out how they had planned to do it, he had been concerned for the girl's safety, only to be reassured that once he saw her from the Red Keep that she would be well taken care of. He had been given his king's word that the life she'd lead would be far better than the one she'd had until now. Standing outside the room, he waited, and when she came out, he hurried along with her, meeting Richard's man Marius outside. Is it done? Marius asked her. It is. He drank it all down, and was gone before I left. Pyxel's serving girl said. Good girl, have you decided? Marius asked. Castamere, my lord, the girl said, and Barristan watched as Marius smiled before handing her a pouch. The girl happy to hear the jingle of coins, and for Barristan looking at her face when she looked inside, she was even happier now. Sir Barristan, I bid you farewell, Marius said as he and the girl walked off into the night, and Barristan, as he turned to head back, found himself thinking that he'd never even asked her name. The next morning, the Red Keep was in an uproar, though the king and queen seemed unperturbed. The king simply asking with no respect or concern for the dead Grand Master for Jon Arryn to make sure that a new one was sent quickly. Robert then continuing on his way. No one grieved for the man, and Barristan found that apt. Despite serving for 40 years, the man had served no king. He'd done no good and caused great harm to those he had sworn to keep healthy. Barristan had found he had slept with a clear conscience the night before, happy that a threat had been removed and knowing that his king was one step closer to the throne. Old Town 2096 AC, Maesters Vaxlin and Gallard. Vaudilin had been surprised by the request and that it concerned Gallard even more so. However, an invite from the Lord was not one they could reject or turn down, and could be a boon to their order. So he had made his way to Gallard, and both men had left to walk to the high tower. They were walking over the bridge when the man came to them. He was very well dressed, and in his hand he was carrying a pouch of gold. Please, my child, I need a maester, the man said, and they directed him back towards the citadel. Please, a moment, just a moment, I'll pay you whatever you wish, the man said, and Vaudilin looked to Gallard, who nodded. Coin didn't particularly interest him, but the man looked important, and when he nodded and the man handed him the pouch, which he handed to Gallard, it was his friend's stunned reaction that sealed it for him. There are over 50 gold dragons in this pouch, the Axlean, Gallard said softly to him, the amount catching him by surprise. What's your name? He asked the man as they followed him. Lord Maester, my wife and I were to visit her father. Though we decided to come to the citadel first, then our babe took sick. Please, this way, he said, directing them towards a small boat. A boon indeed, Vaxley thought with a smirk, and yet, as they walked towards the boat, something felt wrong. Mormonts were from the north, and this man sounded anything but. He paused and turned to ask the man. You don't sound northern, my lord, he said, and Gallard looked at him, confused, before they were quickly surrounded by men who had seemingly come from nowhere. And you two are no true masters either. We'll be a good match on our trip then, won't we? The man said as he smirked, and before he knew what was happening, he and Gallard were bundled up with hoods over their heads. In no more than a few moments they were in a boat that rowed quickly from the riverbank. How long they rowed for, he didn't know. Only that the Honeywine's currents felt stronger. When the hood was removed, he found Gallard was nowhere to be seen. Where his friend was, he didn't know. What he did know was that he shivered when the man moved toward him and cut his binds. Your friend is dead, say hello to him. For me, will you? The man said, and without so much as a blink, he felt his throat being cut, the blood pouring out as he was thrown overboard. He didn't last long, and as he choked on his own blood, the last thing he saw was Gallard's body as it floated by. The Citadel 2096 AC. Master Walgrave. The cage was open. Why? Had he left it open again? He moved to close it and saw the others were open too. Strange, he'd not have opened them all. Surely, though his mind was not what it had once been, he loved his birds, and they loved him. He'd not risk them, harm them, and certainly he'd never let them loose indoors. Would he? Yet as he looked now at the cages, he saw the ravens fly from them. It was a beautiful sight, at least at first. But soon he noticed something strange with their eyes. Ravens didn't have white eyes. They were blue or gray or brown, depending on their age. Never white. No one knew that better than he. For all his life, he'd studied these birds and written about them. To see them now all looking at him with white eyes was disturbing. He felt his fear begin to rise and turned to walk from the room. For the first time in his life, he was actually afraid of his own birds. The cawing soon began, and he hurried, running to the stairs. Every step he took, he looked over his shoulder and expected them to be there, to be following. Then, as he reached the steps, they flew as one. They enveloped him. And for the briefest moment, he flew. The only thing louder than the cawing of the ravens was the flapping of their wings, and the noise was deafening. It was so loud that no one heard his screams or the crack of his skull as he hit the bottom of the stairs. And no one cared about the rattle his throat made as he died. Master Theobald. He had been in the midst of peaceful sleep. The dream he was having was one of the nicer ones, and he'd enjoyed it until the noise woke him up. He tried to sit up but felt pressed down hard against the bed. The pillow pushing down against his face, he couldn't breathe. He felt the lack of air beginning to wear on him, and he struggled unsuccessfully to free himself. Theobald was not a fighter, and whoever was forcing him to the bed was strong, yet he fought hard for his life, or he thought he did. In reality, his blows hit the pillow, and not the man, and even had they'd have been ineffectual. As he heard the sound which had woken him quietened, he wondered why he had thought he heard ravens, and soon felt his head become dizzy from the lack of air. Falling back against the bed with all the fight gone out of him, and soon he knew the life would be too, he heard the voice, and were he not already certain to die then, he'd have welcomed it if it had been offered. Yaxley Targaryen sends his regards, Sir Richard Lonmouth said just before Theobald breathed his last. Casterly Rock, 29-6 AC. Lyrian. She had worried that their time in Sunspear was something she had built up. Had it been more in her mind than in reality? Had she allowed their time apart to cloud her judgment and make her think more fondly of it than it really was? As she breathlessly reached over for the glass of wine, she was more than happy to realize that the reality far exceeded what her mind had made up. Tyrion was insatiable, passionate, and most importantly, giving. He sought to prolong her pleasure while he took his own, something that not everyone did. Since she'd arrived at the Rock, they'd spent as much time together as they could, while still hiding though, which annoyed her. Thankfully at night, though they didn't hide. Either she came to him or he to her. And they spent their time doing everything they could think of to each other. My lion finally rests, she said, sipping her wine. The flush on her chest receding and her breath coming back to normal. My princess has worn me out, he said, and she smiled. If she had, then so had he, with her, she thought, as she took another sip. I am to speak to my cousin today, to meet with the dragons. Aye, Jon's been busy since you got here, Tyrion said, looking to the wineglass which she gave him while she poured herself another. With what? She asked curiously. Something you should speak to him about, or you have me spill all his secrets? He japed, and she laughed. I think you've spilled enough for one night, she said, looking down between her legs and hearing him choke a little on his wine. Do you wish me to come with you? He asked a little later as he was dressing. No, perhaps it's for the best if I meet them alone. We'll speak later, she asked, and hated the small note of desperation in her voice. Amongst other things, I hope, he said, kissing her, and she smirked as he left. She was glad now she'd taken her uncle's advice. Oberyn knew Tyrion, and she had seen it for herself the night she'd arrived. The way he'd looked over the men who were with her, how he'd studied them, and seemed almost relieved that certain ones weren't there. How she felt about him confused her, worried her even. What if he felt different? What if she meant less to him than he to her? These were things she'd never dealt with before. She prided herself on being in control. She was the one who decided how her relationships did or did not develop. Yet with Tyrion, she felt a loss of control, and almost trepidation when she had met him again. Even planning for the visit to Casterly Rock had made her nervous in a way she never usually was, so she had resorted to what she knew, and she could see now that it would have been a terrible mistake. Princess, you sent for me? Her handmaiden asked as Arianne sat in front of the mirror. A little while later, I did. Can you take this to Jon Snow? Give it to one of his guards. I believe they stay in the vaults, she said, handing her a note. I believe Jon Snow has left for the day. Princess, he and some others were planning a ride, though I may be able to catch him. The girl said, and she nodded before calling her back. when she moved to the door. "If you do, ask him. Would it be acceptable for me to join them?" she said, and the girl nodded. A few minutes later, she was surprised when Jon Snow himself knocked on her door. She'd seen the boy a couple of times, but apart from at the dock, it had only been briefly. He was a handsome young lad. His dark gray eyes looked almost black in the light, and his hair was tied up annoyingly. She found she wished to pull the tie from it just to see how it looked. As he stood there smiling, she realized that she'd been staring at him for some time, and so she smiled back and invited him in. "Princess Arianne," he said with a small bow. "Jon Snow, or is it Jaehaerys Targaryen?" she said with a smirk. "I think for now Jon Snow will do, princess. Your lady said you wished to come riding with us," he asked, and she nodded. "We'll await you in the courtyard. I look forward to speaking to you later. But perhaps on this ride, we could keep things more circumspect," he said. "Of course, I heard you're an excellent horseman, Jon Snow. I look forward to seeing you in action," she said, and he smirked as he left. She was slightly disappointed to see so many people in the courtyard. Jon was talking and laughing with a little blonde girl, and she saw the Tyrell and the giant guard who followed Jon around along with the blonde girl who squired for him. There were also some other younger boys and girls, numerous guards, and along with her own, she felt this would be a ride she'd not have fun on. She was soon proved very much mistaken. No sooner were they out of the Rock's gates than the fun began. Firstly, the White Wolf raced ahead, and she saw her guards look at it in awe. The wolf moving far faster than any horse could. Then the girl looked to Jon, and they moved forward. She turned to Tyenn, who seemed eager for some reason, and so she asked what was going on. "They're getting ready to race, Ari," her cousin said. "Oh, a race! I'd like that," she said, and moved towards them before Tyenn could say any more. "To the stream, Jon, no backsies," the little blonde girl said. "No backseat is Joy, ready," Jon said just as she arrived. "Princess, we were just about to race," Jon said, and she caught the annoyed look the girl, Joy, was giving her. "I know, I wish to join you. Myself and Tyenn race all the time back in Dorne," she said, with a smirk. "This isn't Dorne, princess," Joy said, and the girl's smirk was even bigger than her own. "Very well. Up over the hill, there you'll see a stream in the distance. Ghost is probably there already. We race to there," Jon said, and she nodded. "Ready, Joy, princess? Loras, if you will." 1, 2, 3, go," Loras said, saying each of the numbers slowly and then shouting the order to race. She felt the wind in her hair, and the horse under her tensed before it set off. Its speed was impressive, she felt, though compared to the two in front of her, not so much. From an early age, she and Tyenn would race sand steeds through the desert, so she knew her way around a horse. Looking on as the two in front of her raced off, she felt like a novice, a first-time rider. They were dismounted and leading the horses to drink from the stream by the time she arrived, both of them laughing and joking, and she found it endearing. The way he acted with the young girl reminded her of Oberyn, of how he'd play with Yea, or Abella, and the image made her smile. "Who won?" she asked as she dismounted and led her own horse to the stream. "A draw, I think." "Was it a draw, Joy?" Jon asked. "No, I won. You cheated," Joy said, giggling. "There you have it, princess. Apparently I cheated. We should have raced backsies," he said, and Joy laughed louder, now as Jon moved in to tickle her. They ended up having a picnic by the stream, sitting under the shade of the tree, and while it was not dawn, she found the place peaceful. Placing the horses back in the stables when they got back, Jon said his farewells to Joy and to who she learned were the girls who were fostering with her. Once they'd left, he walked over to her and whispered in her ear. "I believe it's time you met my sister," he said. "I'd like that very much. Your guards, princess, I need them to stay here. They won't be allowed in the vaults." She walked over and spoke to the guards, telling them to go back to their rooms and she'd be up later, and despite their reluctance, they agreed. Then walking with Jon, she found herself being led down into the vaults of Casterly Rock, her excitement building as she was about to meet a dragon. Jon led her out onto the beach, and she was surprised to see the White Wolf there waiting for them. Looking to her cousin, she sought permission to touch the wolf. "Go ahead, Ghost won't bite, princess," he said, and she rubbed her hand in the wolf's soft white fur. "Ghost? Is that because he's so quiet?" she asked, and Jon nodded. "He's so soft," she said, and saw Jon smile. "He's a big furball, aren't you?" Jon said, and she swore the wolf shook its head. "When you see them, don't be scared. They'll not harm family." You consider me family? She asked, surprised, even though Oberyn had told her so. Enio was my mother. Oberyn and your father, my uncles. So, cousin, I consider you family, he said, looking to her. And she saw the brief doubt in his eyes. Then we are family, cousin, she said, happy to see him relax. The cave was dark until it was not, and she gasped at seeing them. The smaller one was a bright bronze, and though smaller than the white dragon, it wasn't small by any means. This is my son, Rhaegar. Jon said, and she looked at him as he nodded for her to touch the dragon. Rhaegar? She asked, her breath hitching in her throat, as she felt the warmth of the scales beneath her. For the family, I lost my mother, father, and brother. This is Rox, my sister, he said. And she found herself face to face with eyes of a color she remembered from a time long ago. Reaching out, she touched the dragon's face, feeling the vibrations as it trilled before looking behind her, when Jon laughed as the dragon chirped. She says you've grown up, cousin, and that so has she. So much so that you'll never be able to hold her in your arms like you once did, Jon said, and she felt the tears fall from her eyes. Rosier, she said, leaning into the dragon's head, the eyes more familiar now. Rosier, she said softly as the dragon chirped again. Volantis 295, 296, AC. The Hound. Looking at the things crawling over her, listening to the noises they made, he could barely believe it. Dragons, real-life dragons. She had walked into a fire and came out with dragons. He had been as terrified and scared as he had when Gregor had held him to the flames, and yet he had been ready to follow her into them. Had they not stopped him then, he would have. But she had come out the other side, and she had done what they had come here to do. Dainty had woken dragons from stone. As Shira covered her up and the priests finally let him up from the ground, almost 10 of them it had taken to keep him there. He moved to her and looked her over to make sure she was unharmed, trying not to think of the irony of a woman walking into flames and coming out with barely a mark. Apart from her hair and her brows, though, Dainty was not just unharmed, she was unburnt, too. Are you well? He asked, worriedly. I am, look, Sandor. Dragons, Dainty said, smiling. I can see that, he said, and he rubbed her head, making her laugh. Over the next few days, he watched as both she and Shiera attempted to get the dragons to eat, the little things turning their noses up at every attempt. Finally bored one day, he threw a piece of his own meat at them, and they ate it ravenously. Denier running over and grabbing the rest of the meat from his plate. What the fuck are you doing, you bald fucker? He said angrily. You can get more, they're hungry, you miserable fucker, she said, and she ignored Shiera's glare. The dragons ate the meat just as ravenously as they had the first piece, and it was then they knew they needed it cooked. However, when next they tried, it was the same as before. The dragons turning up their noses at the meat. Maybe we need to cook it for them. Let them see the flames themselves, Dannon said, and Shiera nodded. How are you going to do that? He asked, and shivered involuntarily when Dainty waked the fire, the stick she took out, flaming as Shiera held some meat to it. Once again, they ate that day, but not the next. Though this time they figured it out pretty quickly, with a piece of meat on a knife. Dainty held it in front of the dragons, looking into their eyes. Gregor's, she said, and the green one blew some smoke, the gold one too. But it was the black and red one who managed to produce flames. Each day they grew, and then the flames came from each of them. They were breaking their fast one morning. When names were brought up, try as he might, he couldn't help but take the piss out of Dainty as she sat there, bald, her forehead creased where her brows would be, as she sat in deep thought. You look fucking ridiculous, he said, smirking, as he ate an egg from the plate. What? She said, turning to him. This, it makes me want to just slap it over and over again, he said, rubbing her head. Get off, you mad fucker, she said, giggling as he pulled her towards him. Can't. Maybe it's lucky. If I rub it, maybe I'll have good luck, he chuckled. Get away, Shea. Make him stop, Dane said, and he stopped, turning to see where Shea was. Only to find she wasn't there. Turning back, he saw Dane seeming at the corner, laughing loudly. Made you look, you silly fucker, she said, and he moved as if he was going to grab her, laughing as she squealed when she ran from the room. After sparring that day and then Dainty taking her lesson with Shara, the three of them sat while she fed the dragons. The green one had taken a shine to Shara, the black and red to Dainty, while the other alternated between the two and going after its brothers or sisters. He wasn't sure what they were, and neither was anyone else. I figured it out, Dane said, holding the black and the gold dragons in her hands. I figured what out, Slappy, he said, and she scowled at him before smirking. She hated the name, so every time he could, he said it, and he knew it annoyed her. Their names. This one is Elegon, she said, pointing to the black one. That one is Rike, she said, pointing to the green, and this is Sandorix, she said, looking to him. Excellent choices, Dany. Rhaegar, what do you think? Shader said, and the green dragon chirped. He was staring at Dany, who was, in turn, staring at him. The first he figured was for her mother, and the second her brother. The third, he felt himself choke up, and saw her smile. His own was on his face before he knew it, and so he nodded and got up from the chair, turning to leave the room. Those are stupid fucking names, Slappy, he said as he walked away, and he heard the laughter as he left the room. Standing out on the balcony later that night, he heard the footsteps behind him. Saw her hands as she leaned against the wall, her hood pulled up against the cold. You shouldn't have named it after me, Dany, he said softly. I didn't. I named it after a completely different Sandor, big tall fucker he was, love chicken, always grumpy though, annoying fucker as well, she said as she giggled. Thank you, he said almost under his breath. Thank you, Sandor, she said, and as he felt her arms go around him, he hugged her. Something he'd done very little, even with as close as they'd become. Now fuck off to bed, he said a moment later, and she laughed as she walked away. See you in the morning, she said, and he nodded. Aye, see you in the morning, little sister, he whispered when she left, moving quickly to wipe the tear from his eye. He was amazed by how quickly they grew over the next few weeks. In days they were as big as small birds, and now as big as some of the large eagles they'd seen as they'd traveled here. Their flames seemed to get bigger as they grew, not to mention their personalities began to come more to the fore. Elegon was quiet and reserved until she wasn't, or he wasn't. He still wasn't sure what the dragon was. Rhaegar was happy and playful, while Sandorox was the grumpy one, easy to annoy and keen to bite if you did so. Dany would spend hours talking to them, share too, and the dragons would chirp their annoyance if left alone for too long. They had decided to wait until they could fly and feed themselves before leaving. The idea of them being in cages, or having to carry them around, just too hard to contemplate. Sandor, we must talk, Shiaitier said, coming to his room one night. What's wrong? He asked. A boy came looking for Dane today. With some men, I followed him to a small ship. But he saw me. He thought I was her, she said, and he laughed. Never mind, the age difference alone. The image of both women was vastly different. Dane's ear was just starting to grow back, little more than fuzz on the top of her head, while Sheriff's was longer than Dane's had been when he first met her. What she told him next, though, had him wary. Kinvara called him a false dragon and told him to leave. I'm worried, Sandor. I saw it in a dream once. A cloth dragon swaying on a pole amidst a cheering crowd, Chiara said. Where's this boat? Down by the river, close to the crab stall. The boy has dyed blue hair. He's with a man who wears his hair pulled back in long robes, and another orange-haired man with a beard, she said. I'll go take a look. You and Dany talk to Kinvara. Find out what she knows, he said, grabbing his sword. Sandor, be careful, Chiara said, kissing his unburnt cheek. Aye, I will, should anything happen, he said, and she nodded. He found the ship easy enough. The shy maid was nothing special, and as he sat looking at it, he thought about just going on board and killing all who were on it. If these were more of the Fat Magister's men, then they deserved it. Did they not? As he was debating whether or not to do just that, he saw two women come on deck, one a dark-skinned older woman and the other younger, though not by much. The presence of the women gave him pause. Men he had no problem killing, but women he'd not if it could be helped. He saw the boy come to the deck, his hair now more silver than blue, and then he saw a ghost from the past, which made him wonder. Lonmouth had sent him here to find Dachi to protect her, and he'd not known who it was he served. As he looked at John Connington, he thought that perhaps he was closer to finding out. Smirking, he turned back and headed towards the Red Temple. Casterly Rock 2096 AC. Jazzy! Seeing John climb on a dragon's back was both exhilarating and awe-inspiring, and yet for Jaime it was the fear he felt. In the air, he couldn't protect him, but if he fell, what was he to do? What could he do? Despite John's reassurances, Daisy's and even Jenna's, much to his surprise, he stood and looked on nervously as Rhaenys took to the sky. They saw very little of the flight itself. The night was dark, and the moon, though illuminating, didn't show enough. When the dragon landed, though, Jaime felt a sense of relief, as he did each time John flew on it again. For others, it was the majesty of seeing a dragon with a man on its back, For Jaime, it was watching the boy he most cared for and ensuring he was safe. While Arthur would smile fondly and think of Rhaegar or Walder of his grandmother, Jaime thought of Jon. Only of Jon. As the time came to deal with the Masters, his worries were of a different sort. The princess arrived, and she and Tyrion seemed very friendly. Daisy and Joanna were healthy and well, and yet Jaime was pacing like a madman as he waited outside the cave. "We should be in there," he said to Arthur. "All is well, Jaime," Arthur said. "How do we know he could be hurt? He could need us," he said agitatedly. "He'll call if he does. We must have faith, brother," Arthur said, placing his hand on his shoulder. Time seemed to stretch out forever. How long they actually waited for, he didn't know. But when Jon came from the cave, it didn't matter. Seeing the blood had them all running. Arthur, Loras, Jorah, Brienne, none of them moving as fast as he. When he reached him, he saw, though, that Jon was smiling. He seemed unharmed, and yet the blood was everywhere. "What happened, Jon? The blood, what happened?" he asked. "It's nothing. The magic. It's not my blood," Jon said, and he was confused. "I don't, Jon. I don't." "Come, we'll talk more inside. There's something I need to do." "I'm fine, Jaime. Truly," Jon said, and he nodded. Once he told everyone else he was fine, he, Arthur, and Jon walked to his room, Jon taking off his shirt once he got there. He looked and he knew that Arthur did too. Both of them then looking to each other, relieved that there were no wounds on their king. "The blood, it's the cost of using so much magic, so much power. But it's not like a wound, not truly," Jon said, and he shook his head. "I know it's hard to explain, and I'm not even certain how I know it, but I do. It's useful, though," Jon said as he took out the glass candles. Placing them on the table, Jon held the shirt in his hand and wrapped it around the green one. Calling them close, he told them to watch. Jaxley was amazed by what he saw. The Reach Riverlands, Vale North, and King's Landing, Sunspear, and Old Town. One after the other he saw them, drowned, stabbed, arrows, poison, all of them dead, 14 men in total. Pycelle and Theobald included. "All of them?" Arthur asked. "Aye," Jon said. "So public, Jon?" he asked, and Jon nodded. "There was no other way. The realm will talk, but we have proof of some of their misdeeds. Richard can make it known, if need be. But who are they going to blame? Who are they going to suspect?" "He's right, Jaime. He doesn't exist. Let them talk. Let them search. They'll not find anything to lead them to Jon." "Is that not right?" Arthur said, and Jon nodded. "Not me, not Richard, not anyone. The only person who'd have suspected more would be Marwyn, and he's with us," Jon said, and Arthur smiled. "Arthur, can you give me a moment?" He sat on the seat and waited until Arthur left the room before Jon walked over to him and put his hand on his shoulder. "I am well, truly. This rain's, I know, it's worrying. I worry too, but up there on her back, Jaime, it's like being on Winter. I know you said it wasn't, but it is. This magic, it's like practicing with a sword. It's dangerous. I know that, but the more I do it, the better and easier it is. I know I'll not take any unnecessary risks and will not have to do anything like tonight again for a long time. Perhaps we'll never need to," Jon said, and he nodded, glad to see his concern wasn't unappreciated, and that it was shared. The reports came in over the next few days, the ravens arriving with tales of missing masters and bodies being found. When the note arrived from Richard, though, he breathed even easier. No one suspected any conspiracy. The deaths were being accepted as coincidences, and he wondered if truly the gods were on their side. Something that Daisy seemed to believe when she saw Jon flying on Rhaenix's back. "Only the gods could bless someone so," she said, smiling. "Which gods?" he said with a chuckle. "Jon believes in the same ones as I do. So my gods, not your soft southern gods," she said, her eyebrow raised. The heathen tree gods. Well, once I know," he said, and she laughed. "Is it true he's taking Arthur up soon?" she asked, and he looked at her, wondering where she'd heard it. "Walder told me," she said a moment later. "Aye, it's true. He also says Tyrion will be flying soon as well." "You're worried about him?" "I'm worried about both of them. Jon may think he's unable to be hurt, but we know better. And Tyrion, I worry. Come, let's go put Joanna to bed. Then maybe we can start working on a little brother or sister for her," Daisy said, and he looked at her and saw her nod. Since Joanna was born, she'd been taking moon tea. Neither of them was truly ready for another babe, and they weren't really sure how they'd manage one. Over time, though, it became easier. That Joanna was the quietest babe you could ever hope for helped also. They had talked about another, never seriously, but they had spoken of it, and he smiled as he walked back with her. Apparently, a decision had been made. Citadel 2096 AC. Sam. He had known, deep down inside, he had known this was the plan. Why it was the plan or what they hoped to gain from it, he didn't know, but he knew that Theobald was to die and that he'd play a role. He didn't know that Walgrave was to die also, though when they examined the man and he heard the witnesses speak, Sam breathed a huge sigh of relief. An accident. It was simply an accident. He'd continued to believe that until the rest of the news came in. Had he heard nothing else, then he'd have been certain it was an accident. Only. But when Theoden and Gallard never returned, when their bodies were found with their throats slit, he began to grow concerned. When news came of others too, he grew even more concerned. What had happened? Maesters disappeared, bodies were found, the Grand Maester was dead, and Sam felt like he had played a role in something terrible. He tried to think, to figure it out, and he came back to the Ravens, to the witnesses of the death of Maester Walgrave. Making his way to the hall to break his fast, he saw Payday sitting with Molander and Armin, and made his way over to him. "I'd say it'll be Gorman," Armin said. "Not a Rick," Payday asked. "What about Turquin?" Molander said. "Sam, you're closest to Abros. Who's it going to be?" Payday asked. "Who's what going to be?" he said cluelessly. "The new Gramseer, who is it going to be?" Armin asked. "Oh, Gorman," he said, and Armin nodded, a smirk on his face. "Patey, what did you see when Maester Walgrave died?" Sam asked. "Oh gods, not this story again," Molander said, getting up from the seat and walking away. "I like this story," Armin said. Payday proceeded to tell them of walking through the corridors and seeing the Maester at the top of the stairs, seeing as the birds flew towards him, and then as he fell a few moments later, he told them how he'd run to Ebros's room, and when they returned, Maester Walgrave had already passed. Sam listened eagerly, the birds interesting even more now, and he began to wonder, could he be right? Jon Snow had asked for a favor, and then the man had come. The letter being delivered to Vailian Gallard before allowing him into the Citadel. Then he'd pointed out Theobald to him, and the Ravens attacked Walgrave. He knew the Starks were wards, and that Jon had his wolf first given its size. Was he a ward too? Was he involved in the deaths? Why? What would a bastard from the north want with dead maesters? It didn't make any sense to him, and he knew no one would believe him anyway. The Maxters convincing themselves that, despite all the evidence, these were just coincidences, but for Sam it made no sense. All these men dying, disappearing, all at the same time. And right at the heart of it were Jon Snow and Marwyn. As he slept that night, he began to worry. Did he know too much? What did he really know? And one thought which he couldn't escape from, how do you hide from someone who can be in any animal they wish?